Hey everybody, this is Jeremy with Widen Woodworks. Welcome to another build video. This is going to be part one of a two-part series where I show you how to build this small garden shed. I started working on this project before doing videos, so I didn't get any footage of putting in the foundation, but I wanted to make sure that I talk about it before jumping into the build. We rent the house we're in, so I wanted the shed to be semi-temporary, i.e. no concrete base. So what I did first was to excavate the area for the base of the shed and wood storage, which will be a future project. I moved the flagstone pavers off to the side and I cleared out the dirt. Then I used a hand tamper to compact the soil and laid in these garden trim pieces to define the work area. I poured gravel in and used the tamper to compact it down. I did this until the gravel was about 1.5 inches thick. The shed will sit under the overhang of the roof, but the gravel will help any water that does get under it to drain. I covered the gravel with paver base and leveled it with a shovel. On top of the paver base, I put leveling sand to give the paver something to rest on. Then I put in the pavers. I started in one corner and made sure it was level, then I worked my way down, making sure each paver was level both to itself and in reference to the other pavers. Then I brought the flagstone pavers back and placed them around the foundation to extend the patio area. I used topsoil to fill the gaps between the stones. Now let's jump into the build. The shed is going to match the pitch of the roof, so the first thing I did was to find out what angle to cut the pieces to. I used my angle finder to match the roof pitch. Then I brought that over and scribed the angle onto a piece of OSB. I took my protractor and lined it up with the straight edge of the OSB. Then to find the pitch of the roof, I subtracted the angle of the scribed line from 90 to get an angle of 25 degrees. Before I could get any of the walls up, I needed to create a base for everything to sit on. To do this, I made a basic frame out of 2x4s. I started by using my speed square to clean up one side of the board, then measured and cut two 23-inch pieces to make the short sides of the frame. These pieces, plus the 1.5-inch thickness of the 2x4s on both sides, bring the total width of the platform to 26 inches. The shed is going to be 8 feet long, so I used two full 2x4s to attach the short pieces. Then I used my framing nail gun to fire 2 nails into each joint. I did this on all 4 corners, making sure that everything stayed square. You could use a hammer and nails, or a screw gun with screws, but the framing nailer was a faster option for me, and I had it available, so I used that with 3-inch nails. With the frame in its final dimension, I could now measure out how big the floor of the shed needs to be. I wanted to wait to cut the floor pieces in case the platform ended up being shorter in either dimension. In order to get sheet goods home, I have to have them ripped in half at Home Depot. This means I have a series of 24-inch pieces instead of full sheets. The platform is 26 inches wide, so I ripped 2 pieces of OSB down to 13 inches to create the floor. If I had full sheets, I would have just ripped one down to 26 inches so that the floor was one piece. Since I wasn't in my shop with my table saw, I used a circular saw attached to a Kreg AccuCut to rip the pieces. I set the jig to 13 inches, then ran that along the straight factory edge of the OSB. I set up extra stands to help support the piece while cutting it. Before attaching the floor to the frame, I cut down support pieces to make the frame extra sturdy. These are going in between the long rails, so I cut them to 23 inches just like the outside pieces. I again used my speed square as a guide for my circular saw to make sure everything stayed square. Instead of measuring and marking all 3 pieces at once, I took the extra time to measure between each cut so that I didn't have any errors because of the curve of the saw blade. I wanted at least one of the supports to land on the middle paver stone I had set in the foundation. So I marked a line at 48 inches and lined up one of the support pieces with my square and shot 2 nails in from the first side. Then I turned the whole frame around, squared the opposite side, and shot in 2 more nails. I measured 24 inches from either end of the frame for the other 2 supports. Then I repeated the process of squaring and nailing them in. I placed the whole frame on top of the paver stones, making sure that the center support landed on a set. Then I took the first piece of OSB I had cut down and placed it on top. I used the wall of the house to align it to the back of the frame and shimmied it until it was flush on both ends. Then I fired a nail into each of the corners. With the board in place, I worked my way down each of the supports, firing 2 nails into each. Then I butted the second piece of OSB up to the first, lined it up flush with the frame, and fired nails into the corners, then into all the supports and along the front rail. With the base of the shed ready to go, I could start framing the back wall. The back wall will be 5 upright 2x4s that are 7 feet 3 inches high, with a 25-degree angle on the top, plus 2 8-foot pieces for the top and bottom stretchers. The studs are spaced 24 inches on center, and the whole thing will be sheeted in 1/2-inch OSB. I started by cleaning up one end of each of the uprights with my circular saw and speed square. Then I flipped the piece over, measured out 85 inches, scribed a line, and made my cut. I went back and marked out the angle for each piece by placing the pivot point of the square up to the corner of the 2x4, then pivoting it on axis until the 25-degree mark lined up with the straight edge of the board. Then I used the square as a guide to cut the angle onto the board. I could have made the angle mark first, then just done one cut at the top of the 2x4. But cutting it straight across first leaves the offcut with a square edge if I need to use it for something else. I laid out all the uprights, making sure the 2 straightest ones were on the outside. Then I took my time to make sure each 2x4 was as square as possible before firing 2 nails in from the bottom. With the first board in place, I measured 24 inches from the end of the bottom stretcher and marked a line. I put the next stud in the middle of this line and squared it up to the bottom of the 2x4 and put in 2 more nails. Then I repeated this same process, pulling my tape from the same end out to 48 inches and then out to 72 inches, squaring and then attaching with nails. The ground I was working on was uneven, so I tried my best to keep everything level by placing scrap pieces of 2x4 underneath as spacers to help ensure that the frame was coming together square. The final stud I placed at the end of the bottom 2x4. The process to attach the top stretcher is basically the same as the bottom. I started at one corner, squaring it up, then firing in 2 nails. But instead of going straight down the line, I jumped to the other end of the 2x4 and attached the last stud first. For the middle studs, I didn't measure and mark. Instead, I just used my square to make sure they were aligned properly before shooting in a few nails. Then I flipped the frame over so that the outside was facing up and brought the first sheet of OSB over and aligned it to the bottom edge and corners. There are no horizontal studs on this wall because once the OSB is on, it will make the frame rigid and secure. I fired a nail into one corner, then adjusted the board so it was square with the frame and nailed in the second. With the sheet in line, I secured the other 2 corners, then made my way down the rest of the OSB, securing it to each of the studs. I continued adding sheets to the back of the wall by butting them up to the previous piece, relying on the first piece to be square. I put at least 2 nails in each stud for each piece of OSB. When I got towards the top, there was about 14 inches left. So instead of ripping down a piece to cover the whole space, I used an offcut from the base platform and left a small gap near the roof. If it was freestanding, I would sheet all the way up, but the shed will be butted up against the wall of the house and under the roof overhang, so I'm not too worried about the gap. Now that the back wall is sheeted with OSB, I could lift it into place. OSB is incredibly heavy. Each sheet of 1/2 inch weighs about 50 pounds, and there are nearly 2 full sheets on the wall. So to lift it onto the platform, I grabbed some scrap pieces of 2x4 so that I could lift one side, place it on the scrap, then lift the opposite side and place it. I did this until I was able to get the wall onto the platform base, and then I shimmied it into place. I grabbed a full piece of 2x4 and fired a single nail into the outer stud, which allowed it to swivel to the ground and become a bracer to keep the wall from falling. I then secured the wall to the base by putting a series of nails through the bottom of the wall into the platform. Now I can start framing out the front wall. Off camera, I used a straight edge clamped to the top of the back wall to measure out how tall the front wall would need to be to maintain the 25-degree pitch. Then I could measure and cut 4 2x4s to 73 inches and use my speed square to mark the angle and cut the boards to length. I only used 4 studs on this wall because the doors will encompass the whole middle area where the 5th stud would have been. Because the bottom of the front wall isn't one solid piece, I started with the top. But the process was virtually the same as with the back wall. Lay out the pieces, square up the first stud, use 2 nails to attach it, then move on to the opposite stud and nail it in. The 2x4 I used for the top stretcher was a bit warped, and this caused a hassle in trying to get everything assembled. But I figured that as long as I kept everything square, I could fix the twist when I attached the wall to the base. For the spacing on the middle studs, I measured 24 inches from each end. This gives me a door opening of 48 inches. Instead of using one long 8-foot board for the bottom of the front wall, I cut 2 24-inch pieces. Then I brought those smaller pieces over to finish framing the front wall. I used the square to pull everything in line and shot nails in from the bottom. Since some of these boards were warped, I paid special attention to making sure that they went in together square. When I got to the second set where the big twist in the header board was, I was able to pull it down to level, eliminating most of the warp. Then I squared it up and shot in some nails. Getting the front wall in place was much easier than the back wall, mostly because it didn't have the weight of the OSB. I stood it up into place, then using the bracers from the back wall, fired in a nail on either side to keep the frame upright until I could nail in the side supports. I should have only done one side, as that would have made nailing the bottom 2x4s into the base a lot easier. So I removed one of the bracers and nailed in the bottoms of the front wall to the base platform. With the front wall in place, I could measure the actual distance for the side wall supports. I measured out 18 inches for each support, then marked and cut them with the circular saw. I started with just the 4 pieces at the top and bottom, but we'll come back and add more later. I aligned the supports with the front and back walls, made sure they were square, then fired in nails at an angle from the top and bottom. The supports on the bottom were easy to manage since they were supported underneath by the base platform. The stretchers on the top were a bit harder to hold in place, pull everything square, and shoot in the nails. I used a quick clamp to help hold the pieces in place while I got the first nail in. I made sure everything was square, then attached the support to the back wall as well. With the supports in, the shed frame would stand on its own, and I could remove the temporary brace. To help add stability to the frame, I cut 2 horizontal stretchers for each wall section and made a double thick header over the door frame. The sidewall pieces were measured to 18 inches. The front wall supports were cut to 21 inches, and the header pieces were cut to 48 inches. I also cut 2 26-inch pieces and a 22-inch piece to join at the roof. I measured and cut all the pieces at once and separated them into different piles by size. To place the horizontal pieces, I measured 24 inches from the top and bottom of the back of the shed. This would create 3 mostly equal sections and provide plenty of strength to the frame. Luckily, most of the support pieces fit pretty snug and I didn't have to rely on the clamps to hold them in place as much. The supports on the sidewalls I attached just like the previous ones, making sure they were square, then toe nailing them into place. I was then able to use the placement from the sidewall pieces to align the front wall supports. But because these pieces were perpendicular to the studs, I was able to fire in nails through the studs instead of toe nailing them. To make the header, I took 2 48-inch pieces of 2x4, lined them up so they were square to each other, then shot a couple of nails into them, making them one piece. Then I used clamps to help hold the header in place while I squared it up and shot 2 nails through the studs into each of the header boards. Because the top of the wall is at an angle, installing the header like this gives me a non-angled reference for hanging the doors. It will also give me a way to attach the siding to the front wall when I get to that step. The final step in framing the shed is to attach supports along the roof. I decided to cut 2 longer boards and lay them flat to the underside of the top stretchers of the roof. This will give me a way to attach the roof panel later. So I took the 2 26-inch pieces and lined them up on the outside of the 2nd and 3rd studs, made sure they were square, and nailed them into place. I then took the 22-inch piece and toe-nailed it into place where the center stud meets the front wall. The last thing I'm going to do for part 1 of this build is to assemble the doors. These are just a basic frame butt jointed together. The final size of the opening in the frame for the doors is 69.5 inches by 48.5 inches. I want there to be plenty of room for the wood to move and for the doors to open freely, so I accounted for a 1/4 inch gap on all 4 sides, meaning that the doors needed to be 69 inches tall by 24 inches wide. I cut the longer boards to 66 inches so that with the thickness of the tops and bottoms, it would fit the final dimension. And I cut the short boards to 24 inches. Then I lined everything up, used my speed square to align the 2x4s, and shot in a few nails at each joint to pull it together. I also cut 8 pieces at 21 inches to give the door support in the center and to give me somewhere to attach the hinges when I go to hang the doors. I aligned and nailed 2 of these together and placed them inside the frame so that I could square and nail them into place. Each door has 2 sets of supports, and the supports are 24 inches from their nearest edge. That wraps up part 1 of this build. In part 2, I'll put the siding and finishing touches on. Be sure to like and subscribe so you know when the video comes out.